A king doesn't stop for anyone. But on the frozen northern road, Alpha King Cale Thorn pulled his warhorse to a halt. Not for an enemy, not for a threat, but for a girl dragging a coffin through the snow. She stood alone in the path of 10,000 soldiers, her eyes like shattered glass, her hands raw and bleeding. Inside that crude wooden box was her brother, and she would not move. Not for a crown, not for an army, not for the man whose banner had destroyed her world. This is the story of how one girl's grief stopped a war and changed a kingdom forever. Stay until the end, like this video. Comment what city you're watching from. The northern wind howled like a dying wolf. King Cale Thorn sat rigid atop his black destrier, eyes fixed on the white horizon where the frontier mountains clawed at the sky. Behind him stretched a column of steel and fire, 10,000 men, 200 siege engines, enough force to break nations. The banners of the Thorn Kingdom snapped in the gale, black swords on crimson fields, the mark of a dynasty built on conquest. They had been marching for 6 days. The enemy stronghold of Druvik lay another week north, carved into the cliffs like a cancer. This war had dragged on for 3 years, bleeding the kingdom dry, and Cale had sworn on his father's grave that it would end this winter. One final push, one decisive strike. But now something stood in his way. At first Cale thought it was a shadow, a trick of the snow and light. But as the vanguard riders slowed, confusion rippling down the line, he saw her clearly, a girl, alone, in the middle of the road. She couldn't have been more than 19, dressed in a threadbare wool coat that had once been blue, but was now the color of old bruises. Her dark hair whipped around her face, tangled with ice. Her boots were cracked leather, wrapped with cloth to keep them from falling apart. And behind her, tied to her waist with a fraying rope, she dragged a coffin. It was crude. It was rough-hewn pine, barely nailed together, the kind of thing you built when you had no time and no help. The corners were uneven. The lid didn't quite fit, and it left a deep furrow in the snow as she pulled it forward, one agonizing step at a time. The vanguard captain, a scarred veteran named Garen, rode forward and raised his hand. "Girl!" he barked. "Clear the road!" She didn't move. Garen's jaw tightened. "I said move! The king's army passes here!" Still, she stood. Her face was pale, her lips chapped and bleeding from the cold. But her eyes were something else entirely. They were gray, like winter smoke, and they held a kind of fury that made even Garen hesitate. "I will not," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. The wind seemed to pull back just enough to let the words land. Garen's hand went to his sword. "You dare, Captain!" Cale's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He urged his horse forward, past the startled soldiers, until he was level with Garen. The captain fell silent immediately, bowing his head. Cale studied the girl. Up close, he could see the exhaustion carved into her face, the way her shoulders trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of staying upright. Her hands were wrapped in blood-soaked cloth. The coffin rope had rubbed her palms raw. "What's your name?" Cale asked. She met his gaze without flinching. "Elara Ven." "And what's in the box, Elara Ven?" "My brother." The words landed like stones in deep water. Cale's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, something cold and sharp. "How did he die?" "Soldiers killed him." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was edged with glass. "Soldiers carrying your banner." A murmur ran through the nearest ranks. Garen's hand tightened on his sword hilt, but Cale raised a hand, silencing him. "When?" "4 days ago. They came to our village at dawn. They said we were harboring spies. We weren't. My father was a map maker. My brother was 12. Her voice cracked, just slightly, and she swallowed hard. "They burned our home. They killed my father. My brother tried to run." Cale's jaw clenched. "And you survived." "I hid." The shame in her voice was a blade turned inward. "I hid in the root cellar while they died. And when the soldiers left, I built this coffin, and I swore I would take him north, to the mountain where my mother is buried, before the third snowfall seals the ground." Cale glanced at the sky. The clouds were iron gray, heavy with the promise of more snow. The third snowfall was a northern superstition. After the third snow of deep winter, the ground froze so hard you couldn't dig a grave until spring. If she didn't reach that mountain soon, her brother would lie unburied for months. That mountain is 2 weeks' travel from here, Kael said, through enemy territory. I know. You'll die before you get halfway. I know. Then why are you doing this? Alara's eyes blazed. Because he deserves more than a shallow grave in ash. Because I made him a promise. And because I will not let the men who murdered my family steal that from me too. Silence. The wind howled. The army waited, 10,000 men holding their breath. Kael looked at her, really looked at her, at the girl who had walked 4 days through snow and grief, dragging the weight of her dead behind her, at the girl who stood in front of an army and refused to move. And then slowly, he dismounted. Garen's eyes went wide. Your Majesty! Kael ignored him. He walked past Alara, his boots crunching in the snow, and knelt beside the coffin. He placed one gloved hand on the rough wood, then looked up at her. What was his name? Alara blinked, startled. What? Your brother. What was his name? Her throat worked. Tam. Kael nodded. He stood, brushed the snow from his knees, and turned to face his captain. Garen, take the army south to the river valley and make camp. Wait for my orders. Garen stared at him like he'd grown a second head. Your Majesty, the campaign will wait. Kael's voice was steel. I'm going north. With her? Garen's voice rose in disbelief. My lord, she's a peasant girl with a coffin. The enemy stronghold is days away. The men will follow orders. Kael turned to face the army, his voice carrying across the frozen field. I ride north. General Harvick will take command in my absence. Any man who questions this answers to me when I return. A ripple of shock ran through the ranks, whispers, confusion. But no one dared speak against him. Kael turned back to Alara. You want to reach that mountain? Fine, I'll get you there. Alara stared at him, disbelief and suspicion warring in her eyes. Why? Kael's expression was unreadable. Because if soldiers under my banner killed your family, then I owe you a debt. And because I want to know which of my men are murderers. He gestured to the coffin. Can you still pull it? Alara's jaw set. I've pulled it this far. Good. Then let's move before the next snow buries us both. He whistled sharply, and a supply wagon rolled forward. Kael grabbed a pack, a bedroll, and a coil of rope. He slung them over his shoulder, then turned to Garen. You have your orders, Captain. Garen looked like he wanted to argue, but the look in Kael's eyes stopped him cold. He saluted stiffly. Yes, Your Majesty. Kael walked past Alara, heading north. After a moment, she grabbed the coffin rope and followed. The army watched them go, a king and a girl walking into the frozen wilderness together. And behind them, in the ranks, a shadow moved. 2 days north. The first night, they barely spoke. Kael set up camp in the shelter of a rock outcropping, out of the wind. He built a fire with practiced efficiency, using dry moss and birch bark he'd stripped from a dead tree. Alara watched him in silence, her hands still wrapped in bloody cloth. When the flames were steady, Kael pulled out a tin pot and melted snow for water. He mixed in dried meat and grain, cooking a simple stew. The smell made Alara's stomach clench. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. He handed her a bowl without a word. She took it, her pride warring with her hunger. Hunger won. She ate slowly, methodically, forcing herself not to gulp it down. Kael ate across the fire from her, his eyes on the darkness beyond the flames. You know how to travel in winter, Alara said finally. I grew up on the northern frontier, Kael replied. Before I was a king, I was a soldier, and before that I was just a boy trying not to freeze to death. Alara studied him. Without his crown and armor, he looked younger, maybe 30, though his eyes were older. His dark hair was shot through with silver at the temples, and a scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, white against tanned skin. Why did you really come? She asked. Kael looked at her. I told you. You told me a reason, not the reason. Kael was silent for a long moment. Then he said, because I'm tired of fighting a war I don't understand. Because my father started this war, and I inherited it, and I've been bleeding my kingdom dry trying to finish it. And because if my own men are slaughtering innocents under my banner, then I've already lost. Alara's grip tightened on the bowl. You didn't know. No. His voice was bitter. I didn't know. I sent armies north to fight soldiers, not to burn villages and kill children, but ignorance doesn't absolve me. If it happened, it's my responsibility. And if you find the men who did it, Kael's eyes were cold, then I'll make sure they never do it again. Alara believed him. They slept on opposite sides of the fire. Kael took first watch, his sword across his lap. Alara curled up in her thin coat, too exhausted to dream. But in the deepest part of the night, she woke to the sound of footsteps in the snow. Her eyes snapped open. Kael was on his feet, sword drawn, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. How many? Alara whispered. 3, maybe 4. Kael's voice was low and steady. Stay behind me. But Alara was already moving. She grabbed a burning branch from the fire and stood beside him, her other hand pulling a small knife from her belt. Kael glanced at her, surprised. I'm not helpless, she said flatly. I'm starting to see that. The footsteps came closer. Shadows moved between the trees, quick, deliberate, trained. Then a voice called out, rough and mocking. Well, well, the great King Kael alone in the woods with a peasant girl. How the mighty have fallen. 4 men stepped into the firelight. They wore the black and crimson armor of the Thorn Kingdom, but their insignias were wrong, too new, too clean. Mercenaries, Alara realized, not regular soldiers. The leader was a tall man with a shaved head and a cruel smile. He rested his hand on the pommel of his sword. Lord Malrek sends his regards, Your Majesty. Kael's eyes narrowed. Malrek? My own strategist sent assassins after me? The man shrugged. Nothing personal, just politics. You're too soft, King Kael, too sentimental. Malrek thinks the kingdom needs a harder hand, and he thinks killing me will give him that? Oh, we're not going to kill you. The man's smile widened. We're going to make it look like the enemy did, a tragic loss. A rallying cry for the war effort. Malrek will take command, finish the campaign, and come home a hero. Kael's grip tightened on his sword. You're making a mistake. The only mistake, the man said, drawing his blade, is yours. He lunged. Kael met him mid-strike, steel ringing against steel. The other 3 assassins moved in fast, 1 toward Kael's flank, 2 toward Alara. Alara swung her burning branch like a club, catching the first man across the face. He screamed, stumbling back, and she drove her knife into his shoulder before he could recover. He dropped, clutching the wound. The second assassin was faster. He knocked the branch from her hand and grabbed her by the throat, slamming her against a tree. Stupid girl, he hissed. Alara couldn't breathe. Black spots danced in her vision, but her hand found the knife at her belt. A second blade, small and sharp, and she drove it up under his ribs. His eyes went wide. He let go, stumbling back and collapsed into the snow. Alara gasped for air, her vision clearing just in time to see Kael disarm the leader with a brutal strike, sending the man's sword spinning into the darkness. The third assassin lay motionless near the fire. Kael leveled his blade at the leader's throat. Who else is involved? Kael demanded. The man spat blood. You think Malrek's alone? Half your council wants you dead, Kael. You're too weak, too... Kael's sword moved. The man's words cut off in a wet gurgle. Silence. Kael stood over the bodies, breathing hard. His hands were steady, but his eyes were dark with something Alara couldn't name. He turned to her. Are you hurt? Alara touched her throat, feeling the bruises already forming. I'll live. Kael's gaze dropped to the dead man at her feet. You fight well. I had to learn. The frontier doesn't forgive weakness. Kael nodded slowly. Then he said, We can't stay here. If Malrek sent 4, he'll send more. We need to keep moving. Alara looked at the coffin, still resting in the snow. And Tam? We take him with us. I made you a promise. Together, they broke camp. Kael tied the coffin to a makeshift sled he fashioned from the assassins' cloaks and branches, making it easier to pull. They walked north into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving the bodies behind. And as the first light touched the mountains, Elara realized something. She had stopped the king's army, but now she was walking beside him. And the war, his war, her war, their war, was just beginning. Acham, the Northern Pass. 3 days later, they reached the edge of the Frostfall Pass. It was a narrow corridor of stone and ice, carved between two cliffs that rose like the teeth of some ancient beast. The wind here was vicious, howling through the pass with enough force to knock a man off his feet. Snow swirled in blinding eddies, and the temperature had dropped so low that every breath burned. Kael stopped at the entrance, studying the path ahead. "This is the only way through?" Elara asked, pulling her coat tighter. "The only way that doesn't add a week to the journey," Kael replied, "but it's dangerous. One wrong step and the cliffs collapse. Avalanches are common, and if the enemy has scouts, they'll be watching this pass." Elara looked up at the towering walls of ice. "Then we go carefully." Kael glanced at her, something like respect in his eyes. "You don't scare easily, do you?" "I'm terrified," Elara said bluntly. "But fear doesn't change what needs to be done." Kael nodded. "Good answer." They entered the pass. The world narrowed to a tunnel of white and gray. The sled scraped against stone. The wind screamed. Elara kept one hand on the rope, the other braced against the cliff wall, feeling her way forward. Kael moved ahead, testing the ground with each step, watching for cracks in the ice. He moved with the precision of someone who had walked dangerous ground before, someone who knew that one mistake could mean death. Halfway through, the wind died. Elara froze. "That's not good." Kael's head snapped up. "Run!" The word was barely out of his mouth when the avalanche hit. A wall of snow and ice roared down from the cliffs above, a thundering wave of white death. Kael grabbed Elara's arm and yanked her forward, sprinting toward a shallow overhang in the rock. They dove into the shelter just as the avalanche crashed past, a deafening roar that shook the ground and filled the air with blinding powder. The world disappeared. And then, silence. Elara coughed, spitting out snow, her ears ringing. Kael was pressed against her in the cramped space, his body shielding hers from the worst of the debris. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "No, you." "I'm fine." They waited until the air cleared, then crawled out of the overhang. The pass was buried. The sled and the coffin were gone, swallowed by tons of snow. Elara's heart stopped. "No." Her voice was a whisper. "No, no, no." She dropped to her knees and started digging with her bare hands, clawing at the snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Kael grabbed her shoulders. "Elara, stop." "I promised him," she screamed, rounding on him. "I promised I would take him to the mountain. I promised." Her voice broke. She collapsed forward, her fists pounding the snow. And for the first time since her brother's death, she cried. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't graceful. It was raw and ugly and full of a grief so deep it seemed to tear her apart from the inside. Kael knelt beside her and pulled her into his arms. She fought him at first, but he held on, steady and unyielding, until she finally sagged against him, her sobs shaking them both. "We'll find him," Kael said quietly. "I swear to you, Elara, we'll find him." And they did. It took 2 hours of digging, but Kael finally uncovered the edge of the coffin. Together, they hauled it free, battered but intact. Tam was still inside, still whole. Elara sat in the snow, her hands trembling, and pressed her forehead against the rough wood. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Tam." Kael rebuilt the sled in silence, his movements deliberate and careful. When it was ready, he helped her tie the coffin down again. "We're close now," he said. "One more day." Elara nodded, wiping her eyes. "One more day." They walked on. The truth beneath the snow. That night they camped in a shallow cave, out of the wind. Kael built a small fire, and they sat in silence, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Finally, Elara spoke. "Why are you really doing this?" Kael looked at her. "I told you. You told me reasons, but there's something else, something you're not saying." Kael was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My father died in this war, 3 years ago, in a skirmish on the northern border. He was leading a charge when an arrow took him in the throat. I was 27. I'd never wanted to be king. But the crown doesn't care what you want. He stared into the fire. I inherited a kingdom at war, and I've been trying to end it ever since. But every time I think I'm close, something goes wrong. More men die, more villages burn, and I don't know if I'm fighting to win or just fighting because stopping feels like surrender. Alara studied him. You think this war is pointless? I think, Kyle said slowly, that my father started a war he didn't understand, and I've been bleeding the kingdom dry trying to finish it. And if my own men are killing innocents to keep it going, then maybe the real enemy isn't across the battlefield. Maybe it's in my own camp. Alara nodded. Then we end it. Kale looked at her, surprised. We? You want to know who killed my family. I want justice. And if Malric is corrupt, then he's not just your enemy. He's mine. Kale's eyes held hers. You understand what that means? If we go back and accuse Malric, it's not just a fight. It's a war within the war. Good, Alara said flatly. I've been fighting since the day they burned my home. I'm not stopping now. Kyle smiled, small but real. You're relentless. I'm a survivor. No, Kyle said. You're more than that. They held each other's gaze across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them. Then Alara looked away, her cheeks flushing. We should sleep. Tomorrow's the last day. Kyle nodded. Tomorrow. But neither of them slept well that night, because they both knew that when they reached the mountain, everything would change. Dawn came gray and bitter. Alara woke to find Kyle already awake, standing at the mouth of the cave, staring at the horizon. Snow had fallen during the night, covering their tracks, smoothing the world into a blank slate of white. She sat up, her body aching from days of walking, and unwrapped the cloth from her hands. The wounds had scabbed over, angry red lines across her palms. She flexed her fingers, testing them. They still worked. That was enough. We're close, Kyle said without turning. The mountain's just beyond that ridge. Alara stood and walked to his side. In the distance, a single peak rose above the others, its summit lost in clouds. Even from here, she could feel it, the weight of the place, the finality. My mother loved that mountain, she said quietly. She used to say it was the last place the world still remembered how to be beautiful. Kyle glanced at her. When did she die? 5 years ago. Winter fever. My father tried to save her, but Alara's voice caught. He never stopped blaming himself. Kyle nodded slowly. And now they're both gone. And Tam, Alara's jaw tightened. Everyone I loved is dead, and the only thing I have left is a promise. Kyle turned to face her fully. Then we keep it. They broke camp quickly, packing what little they had. Kale secured the coffin to the sled, checking the ropes twice, and they set out into the snow. The climb was brutal. The terrain grew steeper, the air thinner. Alara's lungs burned with every breath, but she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, dragging the weight of her grief behind her. Kyle stayed close, watching her with a strange intensity. She could feel his eyes on her, not with pity, but something else. Respect, maybe, or recognition. You're stronger than you look, he said at one point. Alara laughed bitterly. I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm breaking. Breaking and broken aren't the same thing. She looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. You sound like you know the difference. I do. Kael's expression darkened. When my father died, I wanted to break. I wanted to walk away from the crown, from the war, from all of it. But I didn't. I held on. And every day since, I've wondered if that was strength or just stubbornness. Maybe it's both. Kael smiled faintly. Maybe. They walked in silence after that, the mountain looming larger with every step. By midday, they reached the base of the final slope. The ground here was rocky and uneven, dotted with graves marked by simple stone cairns. This was the old burial ground, where frontier families had laid their dead for generations. Alara stopped, her breath misting in the cold air. There, she said, pointing to a cluster of cairns near the summit. That's where my mother is. Kael nodded. Let's finish this. But before they could move, a voice called out from behind them. Well, well, the king and the peasant. How touching. Ilara spun around, her hand going to her knife. Kael's sword was already drawn. 6 men stood at the edge of the tree line, all armed, all wearing the black and crimson armor of the Thorn Kingdom. But like the assassins before, their insignias were wrong, too clean, too new. The leader stepped forward, a lean man with cold eyes and a scar that ran from his temple to his chin. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Lord Malrek sends his regards, the man said. Again. Kael's eyes narrowed. He's persistent, I'll give him that. Persistent enough to make sure you don't come back. The man drew his sword. Nothing personal, Your Majesty. Just business. Kael shifted his stance, positioning himself between Ilara and the mercenaries. You're outnumbered. 6 against 2? The man laughed. I think we'll manage. But Ilara stepped forward, her knife gleaming in the pale light. 6 against 2, she said coldly, assumes we're the ones who need to worry. The mercenary's smile faltered, and then Kael moved. He was faster than Ilara expected, faster than any man in armor should be. His sword flashed, catching the first mercenary across the chest, dropping him before he could raise his blade. The second lunged, but Kael sidestepped and drove his pommel into the man's temple, sending him sprawling. The other 4 closed in, flanking him, trying to overwhelm him with numbers. Ilara didn't wait. She threw her knife, catching one mercenary in the throat. He went down gurgling, hands clutching the wound. She grabbed the fallen man's sword, heavier than she was used to but sharp, and swung it in a wide arc, driving another attacker back. The leader cursed and came at her, his blade whistling through the air. Ilara barely got her sword up in time, the impact jarring her arms. He was stronger, more skilled, and he pressed the advantage, driving her back toward the rocks. You should have stayed home, girl, he snarled. I don't have a home, Ilara spat back. You people burned it. She feinted left, then ducked under his swing and slashed across his leg. He stumbled, blood staining the snow, and she kicked him hard in the chest, sending him sprawling. But he wasn't done. He grabbed her ankle and yanked, pulling her down. She hit the ground hard, the sword flying from her grip. He lunged on top of her, his hands going for her throat. And then Kael was there. His sword came down in a brutal arc, severing the man's arm at the elbow. The mercenary screamed, rolling away, clutching the stump. Kael didn't hesitate. He drove his blade through the man's chest, silencing him. Silence fell over the mountain. Kael stood over the bodies, breathing hard, blood dripping from his sword. Ilara sat up slowly, wiping snow from her face, her hand shaking. Are you hurt? Kael asked, offering her his hand. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet. I'm fine. You? I've had worse. He looked at the dead men, his expression grim. Malrek's getting desperate. He wouldn't send this many unless he was afraid. Afraid of what? Of the truth. Kael sheathed his sword. If we make it back, if we expose him, his whole plan falls apart. He loses his power, his influence, maybe even his life. Ilara's jaw set. Then we make sure we get back. Kael nodded. First, we finish what we came here to do. They left the bodies where they fell and climbed the final slope to the burial ground. The wind had picked up again, howling across the summit, and the sky was darkening with the promise of more snow. Ilara found her mother's cairn easily. It was marked with a small iron cross her father had forged, now rusted and worn. She knelt beside it, her hands resting on the cold stones. I'm here, Mama, she whispered. I brought Tam home. Kael began digging a grave beside the cairn, breaking through the frozen ground with a small shovel he'd carried in his pack. It was hard work, the earth stubborn and unyielding, but he didn't stop. Ilara joined him, using a flat stone to chip away at the ice. They worked in silence, side by side, until the grave was deep enough. Together, they lowered the coffin into the earth. Ilara stood at the edge, staring down at the rough pine box. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, she said, her voice breaking. I'm sorry I hid. I'm sorry I didn't fight. Kael placed a hand on her shoulder. You're fighting now. She looked at him, her vision blurred. Is it enough? I don't know, Kael said honestly. But it's something. And sometimes that's all we have. They filled the grave together, covering the coffin with earth and stones. When it was done, Alara built a small cairn on top, stacking the rocks carefully, making sure it would last. She stood back, wiping her eyes, and whispered, "Rest now, Tam. You're home." The wind howled, carrying her words away. And then Kyle spoke. "Alara, look at this." She turned. Kale was crouched beside a flat stone near her mother's grave, brushing away snow. Carved into the stone were symbols, strange, intricate markings that looked like a map. "What is it?" Alara asked, kneeling beside him. Kale traced the lines with his finger. "These are tunnel markings, military notation. Your father was a map maker, you said?" "Yes, he worked for the kingdom, charting the frontier." Kale's eyes widened. "Alara, this isn't just a map. This is a schematic of the enemy's stronghold at Druvik. The tunnels, the supply routes, the weak points, everything." Alara stared at the carvings, her heart pounding. "My father made this?" "He must have. And he hid it here, where only someone who knew to look would find it." Kale stood, his expression intense. "This changes everything. With this map, we can end the war. Not with a siege, not with months of bloodshed, but with one precise strike." Alara's breath caught. He was trying to help. Even at the end, he was trying to stop the fighting. Kyle nodded. "And Malrek's men killed him for it. If your father had delivered this map to me, the war would have been over months ago. Malrek couldn't allow that. He needs the war to continue. It's the only thing keeping him in power." Alara's hands clenched into fists. "Then we take this back. We expose him. We end this." "Agreed." Kale pulled out a piece of parchment and began copying the carvings, his movements quick and precise. "But we need to move fast. Malrek will send more men. And when he realizes we found this..." A sharp whistle cut through the air. Kale's head snapped up. "Get down!" An arrow slammed into the rock beside them, splintering stone. More arrows followed, hissing through the air like angry hornets. Alara and Kale dove behind the cairns, using the stones for cover. Shadows moved at the edge of the tree line, more mercenaries, at least a dozen, spreading out to surround them. "How did they find us so fast?" Alara shouted over the wind. "They've been tracking us the whole time." Kale grabbed his bow and knocked an arrow. "Malrek must have scouts all over these mountains." He rose and fired, dropping one mercenary. But two more took his place. Alara grabbed a fallen sword and crouched low. "We're surrounded." "I know!" Kyle fired again, then swore as an arrow grazed his shoulder. Blood darkened his sleeve, but he didn't stop. "We need to break through the line and get to lower ground." "We'll never make it. We don't have a choice." But before they could move, a new sound cut through the chaos, a deep, rumbling roar that shook the ground. Alara looked up, her blood turning to ice. "Avalanche!" The entire western slope was collapsing, a massive wall of snow and ice roaring down the mountain toward them. The mercenaries saw it too, their formation breaking as they scrambled to escape. Kyle grabbed Alara's arm. "Run! Now!" They sprinted down the slope, the avalanche chasing them like a living thing. The ground shook, the air filled with blinding white. Alara could barely see, could barely breathe, but she kept running, Kale's hand locked around hers. And then the world disappeared. The snow hit them like a hammer, knocking them off their feet, tumbling them down the slope. Alara felt herself falling, spinning, the cold crushing her from all sides. She tried to scream, but snow filled her mouth. And then, suddenly, she stopped. She was buried. Snow pressed down on her from every direction, heavy and suffocating. She couldn't move, couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Panic clawed at her chest. She was going to die here, alone in the dark, just like Tam. No. Alara forced herself to calm down. She flexed her fingers, feeling for any give in the snow. There, a small pocket of air near her face. She pushed against it, creating a tiny breathing space. She couldn't hear anything, couldn't feel Kyle, but she had to believe he was alive, had to believe they would get out of this. She started digging. Her hands were numb, her lungs screaming for air, but she kept moving, clawing at the snow inch by agonizing inch. Her fingertips broke through into open air, and she gasped, sucking in a desperate breath. She pushed harder, widening the hole, until finally she pulled herself free. The world was white and silent. The avalanche had passed, leaving the slope buried under tons of snow. Bodies littered the ground, mercenaries caught in the collapse, frozen and still. And there, a few feet away, a hand jutted from the snow. Kyle! Alara scrambled over, digging frantically. She uncovered his face, his chest, pulling him free. He was unconscious, his face pale, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. No, no, no! Come on, don't you dare die on me! She pressed her ear to his chest. A heartbeat. Faint, but there. She shook him hard. Kyle, wake up! His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Alara? I'm here. Relief flooded through her. Can you move? He groaned, sitting up slowly. I think so. What? Avalanche. Most of the mercenaries are dead, but we need to move before more come. Kyle nodded, wincing as he stood. His shoulder was still bleeding, and he favored his left leg, but he was alive. Alara looked around, her heart sinking. The map. The parchment Kyle had been copying. It was gone, buried somewhere in the snow. The map, she said desperately. We lost it. Kyle reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, stained with blood, but intact. I finished copying it before the avalanche hit. Alara could have kissed him. Instead, she grabbed his arm and pulled him down the mountain. Then let's get the hell out of here. They stumbled through the snow, every step agony, but they didn't stop. Behind them, the mountain loomed, silent and indifferent. Ahead, the forest waited, dark and uncertain. And somewhere in the distance, Malrek was waiting too. But now, Alara and Kyle had something he didn't. They had the truth. And they were coming for him. The descent took hours. Kyle's injured shoulder slowed him down, and Alara could see the pain etched into his face with every step. But he never complained, never asked to stop. He just kept moving, jaw set, eyes fixed on the path ahead. They reached the tree line as dusk fell, the shadows growing long and cold. Kyle finally allowed himself to lean against a tree, breathing hard. "Let me see that shoulder," Alara said. He started to protest, but she gave him a look that silenced him. He shrugged off his coat, wincing, and she peeled back his shirt to examine the wound. The arrow had only grazed him, but the cut was deep, still bleeding sluggishly. She tore a strip from her own shirt and wrapped it tight around his shoulder, tying it off with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before," Kale observed. "Frontier life," Alara said shortly. "You learn to patch yourself up or you don't survive long." Kale watched her work, something unreadable in his eyes. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone broken, maybe? Someone who needed saving." Alara tied off the bandage and met his gaze. "I am broken, but I don't need saving. I need justice." Kyle nodded slowly. "Then we'll get it. Together." The word hung between them. Together. It felt strange on Alara's tongue, foreign and fragile. She'd been alone for so long, carrying her grief like a second skin, that the idea of sharing the weight seemed impossible. But as she looked at Kyle, bloodied and battered but still standing, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. They made camp in a shallow depression sheltered by rocks and evergreens. Kale built a small fire, shielded from view, and they huddled close to the flames. Alara pulled out the last of their dried meat and divided it evenly. It wasn't much, but it was something. "We're 2 days from the river valley," Kyle said, studying the map by firelight. "If we push hard, we can reach my army by tomorrow night. And then? Then we present this map to my generals. We expose Malrek, and we end this war." Alara poked at the fire with a stick. "You think they'll believe you? Malrek is one of your most trusted advisors. If you accuse him without proof—" "This map is proof," Kyle interrupted. "And the bodies we left behind, Malrek's mercenaries, all carrying forged orders. When my generals see that, they'll have no choice but to act. Unless Malrek has more allies than you think." Kale's jaw tightened. "Then we deal with them too." They fell silent, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them. Finally, Alara spoke. "Why are you doing this? Really? You could have turned back at any point. You could have sent soldiers to finish the job. But you stayed. Why?" Kale stared into the fire for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Because I'm tired of being a king who doesn't know his own kingdom. I've spent 3 years fighting a war I inherited, following strategies laid out by men I barely know, trusting advisors who might be lying to my face. And when I saw you standing in that road dragging your brother's coffin, I realized something. He looked at her. You knew exactly what you were fighting for. You had a purpose, a promise. And I had nothing but orders and expectations. I envied you. Elara blinked, surprised. You envied me? You were free, Kael said. Free to choose your own path, even if it led to your death. I've never had that. Every choice I make affects thousands of lives. Every mistake costs blood, and I've made so many mistakes. His voice cracked, just slightly, and Elara saw the weight he carried, the burden of a crown he'd never wanted. She reached out and took his hand. You're making the right choice now, she said firmly. That has to count for something. Kael looked down at their joined hands, and for a moment the hard edges of his face softened. Thank you. They sat like that for a while, hands clasped, the fire crackling between them. And then, without warning, Kael leaned in and kissed her. It was brief, gentle, almost tentative, as if he wasn't sure he had the right. But when he pulled back, Elara's heart was pounding, her cheeks flushed. I'm sorry, Kael said quickly. I shouldn't have. Elara kissed him back. This time it wasn't tentative. It was fierce and desperate, a collision of grief and hope, of two people who had been alone for too long. Kael's hands cupped her face, and she gripped his coat, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elara rested her forehead against his. Don't apologize, she whispered. Kael smiled, small but real. Noted. They stayed close, the fire burning low, and for the first time in days, Elara felt something other than cold and pain. She felt alive. But the moment didn't last. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight. Kael was on his feet instantly, sword drawn. Elara grabbed her knife, her heart racing. Show yourself, Kael commanded. A figure stepped into the light, a young soldier, barely out of his teens, wearing the tattered uniform of the Thorn Kingdom. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Your Majesty, the boy gasped. You have to come back, now. Kael lowered his sword slightly. Who are you? Private Aaron, sire. I was sent by General Harvick. There's been... He swallowed hard. There's been a coup. Elara's blood ran cold. What? The boy looked at her, then back at Kael. Lord Malrek. He claimed you were dead, killed by enemy forces. He took command of the army, and he's planning to march on the capital. Kael's face went white. When? Tomorrow at dawn, sire. General Harvick tried to stop him, but Malrek has half the officers on his side. He's declared martial law. Anyone who questions him is arrested or executed. Kael swore viciously. How did you get away? General Harvick sent me to find you. He said if you were alive, you needed to know. The boy's voice shook. He said to tell you the wolf is in the den. Kael's jaw clenched. Where's Harvick now? Under guard, sire. Malrek's keeping him alive as leverage, but... The boy's voice broke. Sire, I don't know how much time he has. Kael turned to Elara, his eyes blazing. We have to go, now! Elara nodded, already packing their gear. How far to the camp? 10 miles, Kael said. If we run, we can make it by midnight. The boy looked between them, confused. You're going back? Sire, Malrek has thousands of men. And I have the truth, Kael said coldly. And this map, that's enough. He turned to Elara. Can you run? Elara's hands tightened on her knife. Try and stop me. They ran. Through the dark forest, over frozen ground, stumbling and gasping but never stopping. The boy led the way, his young legs fast and sure. Kael kept pace despite his injured shoulder, driven by fury and desperation. And Elara ran beside them, her grief transformed into something sharp and deadly. She had buried her brother. She had kept her promise. Now it was time to make the people who destroyed her family pay. The camp appeared in the distance, a sprawl of firelight and canvas spread across the valley. But something was wrong. The banners were different. Malrek's personal sigil, a serpent coiled around a sword, flew above the command tent. Kale's hands clenched into fists. He's already claimed the throne. Alara stared at the camp, her mind racing. How do we get in? We don't, Kale said. Not yet. First we need allies. He turned to the boy. Where's Harvick being held? The eastern stockade, sire. Under heavy guard. Kale nodded. Then that's where we start. They moved through the darkness like ghosts. The eastern edge of the camp was quieter, away from the main clusters of tents and firelight. Sentries patrolled in pairs, their breath misting in the cold air, but their routes were predictable. Kyle had trained most of these men himself. He knew their rhythms, their blind spots, their weaknesses. Private Aaron led them to a cluster of supply wagons stacked near the perimeter. They crouched behind the wheels, watching the stockade 50 yards ahead. It was a crude structure, hastily built from sharpened logs driven into the frozen ground. Torches burned at each corner, casting flickering shadows across the guard posts. 6 guards, Kale whispered, counting. 2 at the gate, 4 roving. They change shifts every 2 hours. Alara studied the layout. When's the next change? Aaron checked the position of the moon. 20 minutes, maybe less? Not enough time to break Harvick out, Kyle muttered. We'd be caught before we got him clear. Alara's mind raced. Then we don't break him out. We get him to break himself out. Kale looked at her. How? She pointed to a supply wagon loaded with barrels. Those are oil barrels for the lamps. If we create a distraction, a fire, something big enough to pull the guards away, Harvick can handle the rest. He's a general. He knows how to fight. Kale's eyes narrowed, considering. It's risky. If the fire spreads too far, it could destroy half the camp. Good, Alara said flatly. Malrek deserves to watch his stolen army burn. Kale's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Aaron, can you get close enough to the stockade to signal Harvick? Tell him to be ready when the fire starts. The boy's face went pale, but he straightened. Yes, sire. Go. We'll give you 5 minutes. Aaron slipped into the shadows, moving low and fast. Alara watched him disappear, then turned to Kyle. Once this starts, there's no going back, she said. Kale met her gaze, his eyes hard. I know, but Malrek made his choice when he tried to have us killed. Now we make ours. They waited, counting the seconds. Alara's heart pounded against her ribs. Her hands were steady, but inside she felt like a coiled spring ready to snap. Finally, Kyle touched her arm. Now. They moved. Kyle grabbed one of the oil barrels and rolled it toward the stockade, staying low behind the wagons. Alara followed with a second barrel, her muscles straining under the weight. They positioned the barrels near a stack of dry firewood, then Kale pulled out his flint and steel. Once this catches, we run for the northern edge of camp, he whispered. There's a supply route that leads back to the forest. We grab Harvick and disappear before Malrek knows what hit him. Alara nodded. Do it. Kyle struck the flint. Sparks flew, catching on a strip of cloth soaked in oil. The flames spread fast, racing up the cloth and into the barrels. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. The barrels erupted in a roar of fire and heat, flames shooting 20 feet into the air. The guards at the stockade shouted in alarm, running toward the blaze. More soldiers poured from nearby tents, scrambling to contain the fire before it spread. In the chaos, Alara saw movement at the stockade gate. Harvick, a broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and a scarred face, slammed his shoulder into the weakened door, splintering it. He burst free, grabbing a fallen guard's sword, and disappeared into the smoke. Go, Kyle hissed. They ran, ducking behind tents, weaving through the confusion. Soldiers rushed past them, too focused on the fire to notice 2 more shadows in the dark. Alara's lungs burned, but she kept moving, following Kyle's lead. They reached the northern edge just as Harvick emerged from the smoke, blood streaking his face, but very much alive. Your Majesty, he gasped, relief flooding his features. You're alive. Later, Kale cut him off. We need to move before— Find them! The voice boomed across the camp, cold and commanding. Alara turned and saw him. Lord Malrek, standing atop a supply platform, his face twisted with fury. He was tall and lean, with pale eyes and silver hair pulled back in a severe knot. He wore dark robes trimmed with crimson, and around his neck hung a heavy chain of office. "The king lives!" Malrek shouted, pointing toward them. "He's here! Kill him and bring me the girl!" Soldiers turned, weapons drawn, dozens of them, flooding toward the northern edge like a black tide. "Run!" Harvick roared. They bolted into the forest, branches whipping their faces, roots snagging their feet. Behind them, shouts and the thunder of boots echoed through the trees. Torchlight flickered between the trunks, growing closer. Kyle led them deeper, his knowledge of the terrain their only advantage. They splashed through an icy stream, climbed a rocky slope, and finally dove into a hollow beneath a fallen tree, gasping for breath. The sounds of pursuit faded, the soldiers spreading out, searching. "They'll find us eventually," Harvick said quietly. "There are too many." Kale pressed his back against the frozen earth, thinking. "We need to turn this around. We can't keep running. Malrek has the numbers, the supplies, everything. We need leverage." Alara pulled out the folded map, now crumpled and stained. "We have this." Harvick's eyes widened. "Is that—" "A complete schematic of the Druvik stronghold," Kyle said. "Tunnels, weak points, everything. Alara's father drew it before Malrek had him killed." Harvick stared at the map, then at Alara. "You're the girl from the road, the one who stopped the army." "I'm the girl whose family your war destroyed," Alara said coldly. "And now I'm here to make sure it ends." Harvick looked at Kyle. "If this map is real, it is," Kyle said. "I've verified the markings. With this, we can collapse the enemy stronghold in days, not months. The war ends, and Malrek's whole justification for seizing power collapses with it." "Then we need to get this to the other generals," Harvick said. "Men I trust, officers who still believe in the crown, not Malrek's lies." "Can you reach them without being caught?" Alara asked. Harvick smiled grimly. "I've been sneaking through enemy lines since before you were born, girl. I can handle a few corrupt officers." Kale gripped his shoulder. "Go, spread the word. Tell them the king lives and Malrek is a traitor. Rally anyone still loyal and meet us at the old northern garrison at dawn." "And you?" Kale's eyes hardened. "I'm going to confront Malrek. End this tonight." Harvick's face went pale. "Sire, that's suicide." "He has hundreds of men. He has hundreds of men who think I'm dead," Kyle corrected. "When I walk into that camp alive with proof of his treachery, half of them will turn on him. The rest will hesitate. And that hesitation is all I need." Alara grabbed his arm. "You're insane. He'll kill you the second you show your face." Kyle looked at her, his expression fierce. "Then come with me. Show them what Malrek's orders cost. Show them the girl who dragged her brother's coffin through the snow because soldiers bearing my banner murdered her family. Show them the truth." Alara's breath caught. "You want me to testify?" "I want you to fight," Kyle said. "Not with a sword, with your voice. Tell them what happened. Make them see what this war has become." Harvick looked between them. "This is madness." "Madness," Kyle said, "is letting Malrek march on the capital and plunge the kingdom into civil war. This ends tonight, one way or another." Harvick stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You sound like your father." "My father started a war he didn't understand," Kyle said quietly. "I'm going to finish it." Harvick clasped his arm, then disappeared into the darkness, moving like a shadow. Alara turned to Kyle. "If we do this, if we walk into that camp, we're putting everything on the line, our lives, the map, all of it." "I know. And if it doesn't work?" Kyle's smile was bitter. "Then at least we'll die trying to do the right thing. That's more than most kings can say." Alara wanted to argue, to tell him this was reckless, that there had to be another way. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the same fire that had driven her to drag a coffin through a blizzard, the same stubborn refusal to let the people who destroyed everything she loved walk away unpunished. "All right," she said, "let's end this." They circled back toward the camp, moving carefully, avoiding patrols. The fire had been contained, but smoke still hung thick in the air. Soldiers milled about, tense and alert, but the chaos had subsided. Kyle led Alara to the edge of the command area, where the largest tents clustered around a central pavilion. Malrek's banner flew above it, the serpent coiled and waiting. When we go in, Kael whispered, let me do the talking at first. But when I give you the signal, tell them everything. Don't hold back. Make them feel it. Alara nodded, her throat tight. Kael straightened, stepping out of the shadows. Now! They walked into the firelight together. The reaction was instant. Soldiers froze, staring. Weapons were raised, then lowered in confusion. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire. The king! He's alive! But Malrek said... Kael strode forward, his bearing regal despite his battered appearance. I am King Kael Thorn, he called out, his voice carrying across the camp. And I am very much alive. The tent flap burst open, and Malrek emerged, his face a mask of shock that quickly twisted into rage. Impossible, he hissed. You were supposed to be dead. Disappointed? Kael's smile was cold. I know you sent assassins, Malrek. I know you've been orchestrating attacks on villages, killing innocents under my banner to prolong this war. And I know why. Malrek's eyes narrowed. You know nothing. I know you need this war, Kael said, stepping closer. Because without it, you're just another advisor. But with it, with the chaos, the fear, the desperation, you can position yourself as the strong hand the kingdom needs. You can seize power and no one will question it, except you made one mistake. And what's that? Kael gestured to Alara. You killed her family, and she didn't die quietly. Every eye turned to Alara. She felt the weight of their stares, hundreds of soldiers watching her, judging her. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall. My name is Alara Ven, she said, her voice shaking at first, then growing stronger. 4 days ago, soldiers wearing the king's banner came to my village. They said we were harboring spies. We weren't. My father was a map maker. My brother was 12 years old. They burned our home. They killed my father. My brother tried to run and they cut him down in the street. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. I buried him on the mountain where my mother rests, because I promised him he wouldn't die alone in the ashes. And when I stood on that road dragging his coffin, I didn't know if the king was a monster or a man. But I know now. She pointed at Malrek. This man gave those orders. This man is using the king's name to commit atrocities, to keep a war going that should have ended months ago. And if you follow him, you're not soldiers, you're murderers. Silence. Malrek's face had gone white. She's lying. Am I? Alara pulled the bloodstained map from her coat and held it up. My father created this, a complete map of the enemy's stronghold at Druvik. He was going to deliver it to the king, to end the war. But your men killed him before he could. Because you couldn't allow the war to end, could you, Malrek? Not when it's the only thing keeping you in power. Malrek's hand went to his sword. You have no proof. Don't I? Kael stepped forward, pulling a folded parchment from his coat. This is a copy of the orders sent to the men who attacked Alara's village. Orders bearing your seal, Malrek. Not mine. Yours. Murmurs rippled through the soldiers. Officers exchanged glances, doubt creeping into their expressions. Malrek's eyes darted around, calculating. Then he smiled, cold and cruel. You think you've won? He said softly. You think a tearful story and a piece of paper will turn my men against me? They're not your men, Kael said. They're the kingdom's men, and they swore an oath to the crown, not to you. Malrek laughed. The crown? You're weak, Kael. Your father knew it. That's why he spent his last years trying to turn you into something you're not, a warrior. A conqueror. But you're just a boy playing king, making sentimental choices that get people killed. He gestured to the soldiers. These men don't want sentiment. They want strength. They want a leader who will win, no matter the cost. And that's what I'll give them. Kael's jaw clenched. Even if it means tearing the kingdom apart? The kingdom is already broken, Malrek said. I'm just putting the pieces back together my way. He drew his sword. Kael's hand went to his own blade, but before he could move, a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. Stand down, Malrek. General Harvik pushed through the soldiers, flanked by a dozen officers. Their swords were drawn, but they weren't pointed at Kael. They were pointed at Malrek. It's over, Harvik said. These men have heard the truth. They've seen the proof. And they've made their choice. Malrek's face twisted with fury. You think they'll follow a dead king and a peasant girl over me? I control the supply lines, the strategic positions, You control nothing, a new voice said. A young captain stepped forward, removing his helmet. His face was young, but his eyes were hard. My village was burned 2 months ago. They told us it was enemy raiders. But now I see the truth. It was you. Another soldier spoke up. My brother died in an attack that should never have happened. You sent him into a trap. More voices joined in, anger rising like a tide. Officers who had stood silent now stepped forward, their loyalty crumbling. Malrek's hand tightened on his sword. Fools, all of you, you'll regret this. The only one with regrets, Kael said coldly, is you. Malrek lunged, but he didn't aim for Kael. He aimed for Alara. His blade flashed toward her throat. Too fast. Too sudden. Alara tried to move, but her body was frozen, shock locking her in place. And then Kael was there. He threw himself between them, his sword coming up to block Malrek's strike. Steel rang against steel, the impact jarring both men. Kael shoved Malrek back, then pressed forward, driving him toward the edge of the firelight. They fought like demons, swords clashing, sparks flying. Malrek was skilled, his movements precise and deadly. But Kael fought with something deeper than skill. He fought with rage, with grief, with the weight of every life lost to Malrek's ambition. Alara watched, her heart in her throat, as the two men circled each other. Around them, the soldiers had formed a ring, watching in silence. Malrek feinted left, then struck right, his blade slicing across Kael's ribs. Blood bloomed on Kael's shirt, but he didn't stop. He pivoted, bringing his sword down in a brutal arc that Malrek barely blocked. "You're bleeding out, boy," Malrek hissed, "just like your father, weak, sentimental, doomed." Kael's eyes blazed. "My father may have been flawed, but at least he fought for something he believed in. You fight for nothing but power." He struck again, faster this time, and Malrek stumbled. Kael pressed the advantage, raining blow after blow, driving Malrek back until the older man's heel caught on a root. Malrek fell, his sword flying from his hand. Kael stood over him, blade leveled at his throat. The camp held its breath. "Any last words?" Kael asked quietly. Malrek spat blood. "You won't do it. You're too weak." Kael's sword moved, but it didn't strike Malrek's throat. Instead, Kael drove the blade into the ground beside Malrek's head, inches from his ear. "You're right," Kael said. "I won't kill you. Because you're going to stand trial. You're going to face every family you destroyed, every soldier you betrayed. And you're going to spend the rest of your miserable life knowing that the kingdom you tried to steal rejected you." He stepped back. "Harvick, arrest him." Guards moved forward, hauling Malrek to his feet. The former advisor's face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This isn't over," Malrek spat. "I have allies." "Not anymore," Harvick said. "Every officer you corrupted has been identified, every forged order traced. You're done, Malrek." They dragged him away, his protests fading into the night. Kael turned to face the assembled soldiers. His side was bleeding, his face pale, but he stood tall. "This war," he said, his voice carrying across the camp, "started because my father believed we had no choice. But he was wrong. We always have a choice. And tonight, you've made yours. You've chosen honor over ambition, truth over lies. And for that, I thank you." He held up the map. "Tomorrow, we march on Druvik. Not to prolong this war, but to end it. With this map, we can strike fast and precise. We can bring our soldiers home. We can rebuild what we've lost." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them. "Who stands with me?" For a moment, silence. Then one by one, the soldiers raised their swords. "For the king!" Harvick shouted. "For the king!" The camp roared back. Alara watched as the sea of faces turned toward Kael, their voices rising in a single thunderous chorus. And for the first time since her family died, she felt something other than grief. She felt hope. Kael turned to her, his eyes bright despite the pain. "We did it." Laura nodded, her throat tight. "We did." But before either could say more, a scout burst into the clearing, his face wild with panic. "Sire, the enemy, they're here! Druvik's forces, they've broken through the northern defenses, thousands of them marching straight for us." The camp erupted into chaos. Soldiers scrambled for weapons, officers shouting orders, the brief moment of unity shattered by the sudden threat. Kael's face went white. How long until they reach us? An hour, maybe less, Harvick swore. We're not ready for a full assault. Half the men are scattered, supplies are low. Elara grabbed Kael's arm. The map. Use the map. Kael looked at her confused. What? You said it shows weak points in their stronghold, but it also shows their supply routes, their troop movements. If they're marching this many men toward us, they've left Druvik vulnerable. Understanding dawned in Kael's eyes. A counterstrike. Exactly. Send a small force, fast, precise, to hit Druvik while their army's here. Collapse the stronghold, cut off their retreat, and their forces will have nowhere to fall back to. Harvick stared at her. That's insane. We'd be splitting our forces. We're already split, Elara said. But if we take Druvik, this war ends tonight, one way or another. Kael looked at the map, then at his generals, then back at Elara. A slow smile spread across his face. She's right. He turned to Harvick. Take 500 of our best men, fast riders, light armor. Use the tunnels in the map to infiltrate Druvik. Collapse the main supports, destroy their armory, and get out before their army realizes what's happening. Harvick's eyes widened. And you? I'll hold them here, Kael said. Long enough for you to finish the job. Sire, you'll be outnumbered 3-1. Then we'd better make every man count. Kael's voice was steel. Move, now. Harvick hesitated, then saluted. Yes, Your Majesty. He sprinted off, shouting orders, and within minutes, 500 riders were thundering north toward Druvik. Elara turned to Kael. You know this is suicide. I know. And you're doing it anyway. I am. She grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. Then I'm staying with you. Elara. Don't argue, she said fiercely. I didn't drag my brother through a blizzard just to watch you throw your life away. If you fight, I fight. That's the deal. Kael stared at her, something breaking in his expression. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, hard, desperate, filled with everything they didn't have time to say. When they broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. Stay alive, he whispered. You too. The enemy appeared on the horizon like a black storm, thousands of them, armored and armed, their banners snapping in the wind. War drums thundered, shaking the ground, and the air filled with the roar of voices raised in battle cries. Kael stood at the front of his forces, sword drawn, the map tucked safely in his coat. Behind him, his soldiers formed ranks, fewer than 1,000, battered and exhausted, but holding the line. Elara stood beside him, a borrowed sword in her hands, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The enemy charged, and the world exploded into violence. Steel met steel, with the sound like thunder splitting the sky. The first wave of enemy soldiers crashed into Kael's lines like a battering ram against a crumbling wall. Men screamed, blood sprayed across frozen ground, and the air filled with the sick crunch of bone and the wet slide of blades finding flesh. Elara swung her borrowed sword, catching an enemy soldier across the shoulder. He stumbled, and she drove her boot into his knee, sending him sprawling. Another came at her from the left, his axe whistling toward her head. She ducked, feeling the wind of the blade pass above her, and slashed upward, opening his thigh. He went down screaming. Beside her, Kael fought like a man possessed. His sword moved in brutal arcs, each strike precise and deadly. Blood matted his hair, his wounded side painting his shirt crimson, but he never stopped moving, never gave ground. "Hold the line!" he roared. "Don't let them break through!" But the enemy kept coming, wave after wave, an endless tide of steel and fury. Kael's forces were outnumbered 3-1, and the gap was showing. Men fell, the line buckled, and panic rippled through the ranks. Elara saw it happening, the moment when discipline would shatter and the retreat would begin. They had minutes at best before the whole defense collapsed. She grabbed Kael's arm. "We need to fall back, regroup at the—" "No!" Kael's eyes were wild. "If we break now, they'll chase us down and slaughter us. We hold here or we die here." "Then we're going to die here," Elara shouted back. "Look around, we can't—" An explosion rocked the battlefield. Everyone froze. Enemy and ally alike turned toward the northern horizon, where a massive plume of fire and smoke was rising into the night sky, painting the clouds orange and red. "Druvik, Harvick had reached the stronghold, a heartbeat of silence. Then chaos erupted in the enemy ranks. The fortress, they've struck Druvik. We're cut off. The enemy commander, a huge man in black plate armor, rode to the front of his lines, screaming orders. Stand your ground! The fortress doesn't matter if we take the king. Push forward! But the damage was done. The enemy soldiers hesitated, their formation wavering. Some looked back toward the distant flames, fear replacing fury in their eyes. Kyle saw the opening. Now, he bellowed, drive them back. His forces surged forward, crashing into the confused enemy lines with renewed fury. The enemy wavered, their momentum broken, and suddenly it was Kyle's men pushing forward, driving the invaders back step by bloody step. Alara fought beside him, her sword rising and falling, her arms burning with exhaustion. She didn't think, didn't feel, she just moved, survived, endured. And then, cutting through the chaos, a single horn blast echoed across the battlefield. Alara's heart leapt. That was the signal, Harvick's signal, mission complete. Kyle heard it too. His face split into a savage grin. Druvik has fallen, he shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield. Your stronghold is destroyed. Your supplies are gone. Surrender now or die here. The enemy commander's face went white. He wheeled his horse, staring at the flames on the horizon, and for the first time Alara saw doubt crack his iron resolve. Retreat, he finally roared. Fall back. Regroup at... But there was nowhere to regroup. Druvik was gone. Their supply lines were severed. Their fortress was rubble. The enemy broke. They turned and ran, a panicked rout, throwing down weapons and armor in their desperation to escape. Kyle's forces pursued for a short distance, then stopped, too exhausted to chase them far. Alara stood in the center of the carnage, breathing hard, her sword dripping red. Around her, men collapsed to their knees, weeping with relief or pain or both. The ground was littered with bodies, the snow stained dark. Kale walked toward her, limping heavily, his face pale beneath the blood and grime. He stopped in front of her, swaying slightly. We did it, he said, his voice hoarse. We actually did it. Alara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Kyle's eyes rolled back and he collapsed. She caught him, barely, his weight nearly taking her down with him. Kale, stay with me. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. I'm fine, just tired. You're bleeding out, you stubborn bastard. Alara lowered him to the ground, tearing at his shirt to expose the wound on his side. It was deep, still weeping blood, and his skin was cold to the touch. Medic, she screamed. I need a medic now. Soldiers rushed over, and within moments, Kyle was being carried toward the medical tents. Alara followed, her hands shaking, her mind numb. She had survived the battle. They had won, but watching Kale's blood soak into the stretcher, she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd lost something irreplaceable too. The medical tent smelled of blood and herbs and desperation. Alara sat beside Kyle's cot, watching the physician work. The man was old, his hands steady despite the chaos outside, and he moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had sewn too many wounds to count. Will he live? Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The physician glanced at her. The blade missed the vital organs, but he's lost a lot of blood. The next few hours will tell. He finished stitching the wound, wrapped it in clean linen, and stepped back. Keep him warm. Make sure he drinks if he wakes. And hope. Alara nodded, though the word felt hollow. She'd stopped believing in hope the day her family burned. The physician left, and Alara was alone with Kyle's shallow breathing and the distant sounds of the camp settling. She took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength still coiled in his fingers even now. He looked younger in sleep. The hard lines of his face softened, the weight of the crown temporarily lifted. Don't you dare die on me, she whispered. Not after everything. Not when we're this close. His fingers twitched, but he didn't wake. Hours passed. Alara dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, her hand never leaving his. Finally, as dawn light filtered through the tent canvas, Kyle's eyes opened. Alara? She straightened, relief flooding through her. I'm here. He tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. What happened? Did Harvick... Druvik is destroyed, Alara said. The enemy retreated. The war is over. Kyle closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. We won. We survived, Alara corrected. There's a difference. A faint smile touched his lips. You sound like me. Maybe you're rubbing off on me. He opened his eyes again, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Thank you for staying, for fighting, for everything. Alara squeezed his hand. You gave me a reason to keep going. I should be thanking you. Before either could say more, the tent flap opened and General Harvick strode in, his armor scorched and dented, but his face alight with triumph. Your Majesty, he said, bowing, I bring good news. Druvik has fallen completely. We collapsed the main support tunnels, destroyed their armory, and captured their war council. The enemy commander surrendered an hour ago. Kyle pushed himself up on his elbows, ignoring the pain. Casualties. 43 dead, twice that wounded, but we accomplished the mission. Harvick's expression sobered. Your father's map was accurate down to the last detail. Without it, we'd still be fighting. He turned to Alara. Your father saved countless lives, girl. I hope you know that. Alara's throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak. Kale struggled to sit fully upright. What about Malrek? Locked in the stockade under heavy guard, Harvick said. Several of his co-conspirators have confessed. We have enough evidence to convict him 10 times over. Good. Kale's voice was cold. Prepare a tribunal. I want every officer, every soldier, to see what happens to traitors. Already arranged, sire, but there's something else. Harvick hesitated. The men are asking for you. They want to see their king. They need to know you're alive. Kale looked down at his bandaged side, then at Alara. Help me up. You should rest, she began. I've rested enough. He held out his hand. Alara sighed, but she took his arm and helped him stand. He swayed, gritting his teeth against the pain, but he stayed upright. Together they walked out of the tent. The camp had transformed overnight. The chaos and fear had been replaced by a strange, fragile hope. Soldiers moved with purpose, tending to the wounded, repairing equipment, rebuilding what had been broken. And when Kyle emerged, leaning on Alara's shoulder, a silence fell over the clearing. Then, one by one, the soldiers knelt. Thousands of them, dropping to one knee, their heads bowed. Kyle stared at them, his eyes bright with emotion. Rise, he said, his voice rough but carrying. All of you, rise. They stood, but the reverence in their faces remained. Kyle stepped forward, Alara still supporting him. 3 years ago, my father began a war he believed was necessary. I inherited that war, and I've spent every day since trying to end it. But I was blind. I trusted the wrong people. I let ambition and corruption poison my command, and innocent people died because of it. His gaze swept across the assembled faces. Alara Venn lost her entire family because soldiers wearing my banner followed orders from a traitor. Her father was murdered for trying to help us. Her brother died for nothing, and she had every right to let me march past her on that road and let this war consume us all. He looked at Alara, and she saw the weight of his gratitude, his respect, his something deeper she didn't have words for. But she didn't, Kyle continued. She stood in the road and made me see what I'd been too afraid to look at. And because of her courage and her refusal to accept the easy lie, we're standing here today. The war is over, not because I'm a great king, but because a girl from the frontier refused to let her brother's death be meaningless. He turned back to the soldiers. I don't deserve your loyalty, but I swear to you now, on the graves of everyone we've lost, on the blood we've shed, I will be better. I will rebuild this kingdom into something worth believing in, and I will never again let corruption and ambition destroy the lives of the people I'm sworn to protect. Silence. Then a single voice called out, Long live the king! The cry spread like wildfire. Long live the king! Long live the king! Alara felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time they weren't born of grief. They were something else. Relief, maybe. Or hope. Kyle leaned close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. I meant what I said. You saved us. We saved each other, Alara whispered back. A commotion at the edge of the camp interrupted the moment. Riders approached, their horses lathered with sweat, their faces urgent. The lead rider dismounted and ran to Kael, dropping to one knee. "Your Majesty, urgent news from the capital." Kael's expression hardened. "What is it?" "Lord Malrek's allies in the capital have staged an uprising. They've seized the palace and declared martial law. They're claiming you died in battle and that they're acting to preserve order." The camp erupted in angry shouts. Harvick swore viciously. Kael's face went white, then flushed with fury. "How many men do they have?" "At least 1,000, sire. Maybe more. They've barricaded themselves in the inner city and are threatening to execute anyone who opposes them." Alara felt her stomach drop. "This isn't over." "No," Kael said grimly. "It's not." He turned to Harvick. "How fast can we march on the capital?" 3 days if we push hard, but sire, the men are exhausted." "They'll have to endure," Kael said. "We didn't end one war just to let another begin. We move at first light." Harvick saluted. "Yes, Your Majesty." The camp exploded into motion, soldiers scrambling to pack, officers shouting orders. Alara helped Kael back toward his tent, her mind racing. "You can barely stand," she said quietly. "How are you going to lead an army?" "The same way I've done everything else," Kael replied. "Badly, but with conviction." Despite everything, Alara laughed. "You're impossible." "I'm stubborn. There's a difference." They reached his tent, and Kael sank onto his cot with a grimace. Alara knelt beside him, unwrapping the bandage to check the wound. The stitches were holding, but the flesh around them was inflamed. "You need rest," she said firmly. "Real rest, not this." "I'll rest when Malrek's allies are in chains," Kael said. He caught her hand, holding it gently. "But I need you to do something for me." "What?" "When we reach the capital, I want you to speak to the people. Tell them what happened. Show them the truth." Alara's eyes widened. I'm nobody. Why would they listen to me?" "Because you're not nobody," Kael said fiercely. "You're the girl who stopped an army. You're the daughter of a man who died trying to end a war. And you're the person who made a king remember what he's supposed to be fighting for." He squeezed her hand. "They'll listen. I know they will." Alara wanted to argue, to tell him she wasn't ready, that she was just a girl from a burned village who'd gotten lucky. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw something she'd never expected. He believed in her. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll do it." Kael smiled, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed lighter. But the moment was shattered by a shout from outside. "Fire! The stockade's on fire!" They rushed out of the tent, Kael limping, Alara steadying him, and saw flames roaring from the eastern edge of camp. Soldiers ran toward it with buckets, but the blaze was already spreading. "Malrek," Kael hissed. "He's trying to escape." They pushed through the chaos, reaching the stockade just as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Guards were dragging wounded men clear, their faces blackened with smoke. "Where's the prisoner?" Kael demanded. A young guard, coughing violently, pointed toward the flames. He locked himself inside, said he'd rather burn than face your justice." Alara stared at the inferno. Through the smoke and fire, she could see a silhouette. Malrek, standing in the center of the blaze, arms spread wide, laughing. "He's insane," she whispered. "No," Kael said quietly. "He's a coward. He knows what's waiting for him, and he chose the easy way out." They watched as the stockade collapsed completely, the flames consuming everything. When the fire finally died, there was nothing left but ash and charred wood. Malrek was gone. Kael turned away, his expression unreadable. "Burn the remains. We march at dawn." The camp fell into an uneasy silence that night. Soldiers huddled around fires, speaking in low voices, their eyes haunted. They had won the battle, destroyed the enemy's stronghold, ended a 3-year war. But the cost weighed heavy, and the knowledge that more fighting lay ahead drained what little triumph remained. Alara sat alone near the edge of camp, staring at the stars. The same stars she'd watched with Tam on cold winter nights, when the world still made sense and her family was whole. She heard footsteps behind her but didn't turn. Kael sat down beside her, moving carefully. "Can't sleep?" "Too much in my head," Alara said. "I keep thinking about what comes next. The capital, Malrek's allies, all of it. Scared?" "Terrified." Kael nodded. "Me too." They sat in silence for a while, the night wind cold against their faces. Finally, Alara spoke. When this is over, when the capital is secure and the kingdom is stable, what happens to me? Kael looked at her surprised. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not a soldier. I'm not nobility. I'm just a girl who got caught up in something bigger than herself. Once the dust settles, where do I fit? Kael was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, wherever you want. You've earned the right to choose your own path. And if I don't know what that path is? He smiled faintly. Then you figure it out. The same way you figured out everything else, one stubborn step at a time. Alara laughed despite herself. Is that your strategy for ruling a kingdom? It's worked so far. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a king but a man, scarred, exhausted, carrying burdens no one should bear alone. And she saw something else too, something that made her heart ache and soar at the same time. Kael, she said softly. He turned to her, and the question in his eyes was answer enough. She leaned in and kissed him. It was different from before, slower, deeper, filled with a tenderness that felt both fragile and unbreakable. When they finally pulled apart, Kael rested his forehead against hers. Stay with me, he whispered. When this is over, don't disappear. Alara's breath hitched. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? I promise. They sat together under the stars, two souls who had found each other in the ashes of war, holding on to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the ruins. The next morning brought fresh snow and bitter cold, but the army marched anyway. Kael rode at the front despite his wound, his face set with grim determination. Alara rode beside him, wrapped in a borrowed fur cloak, her hands steady on the reins despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Behind them stretched a column of nearly 3,000 soldiers, everyone who could still march after the battle. They moved in disciplined silence, their breath misting in the air, their boots crunching through the snow. On the second day, they passed through a village that had been caught in the war's crossfire. Burned homes stood like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. A few survivors emerged from hiding, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. Kael ordered the column to halt. He dismounted, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches, and approached the villagers. I am King Kael Thorn, he said. The war is over. Druvik has fallen. But I need to know. Did soldiers come through here, soldiers claiming to act in my name? An old woman stepped forward, her back bent with age. Aye, your majesty. 2 weeks passed. They demanded food, burned what we wouldn't give, and took 3 of our young men for conscription. Said anyone who resisted was a traitor. Kael's jaw clenched. Did they say who sent them? A lord named Coffin said he spoke for the crown. The woman's eyes were sharp despite her age. But you're alive, so they lied. They did. Kael turned to Harvick. Leave supplies, food, medicine, whatever we can spare, and send word ahead. Any village that suffered under false orders will receive compensation from the royal treasury. Harvick nodded and began organizing the distribution. The villagers watched in stunned silence as soldiers unloaded sacks of grain, bundles of firewood, medical supplies. The old woman approached Kael again, her eyes wet. Why? We're nobody, just people who got caught in the middle. That's exactly why, Kael said, because you shouldn't have been caught in the middle, because the crown failed to protect you, and because I intend to make sure it never happens again. The woman touched his hand, her fingers trembling. You're a good king. Kael's expression was pained. I'm trying to be. They left the village an hour later, but the encounter stayed with Alara. She saw the way Kael's shoulders had straightened, the way his eyes had hardened with renewed purpose. This wasn't just about reclaiming a throne anymore. It was about rebuilding trust that had been shattered. On the third day, the capital came into view. Dawn came gray and bitter, painting the horizon in shades of iron and ash. The capital rose from the valley like a crown of stone and steel, its walls stretching high and forbidding, its towers piercing the low-hanging clouds. Even from miles away, Alara could see the smoke curling from its chimneys, the banners flying from its battlements. But they were wrong. Instead of Kael's black sword on crimson, she saw serpents coiled around swords, the personal sigil of Lord Coffin. Malrek's second-in-command had claimed the city. They're bold, Harvick muttered, riding up beside them. Raising their own banner before we're even dead. Desperation, Kale said. They know if I reach the city alive, their lie collapses. They're gambling everything on killing me before the people see me. Alara studied the walls. Archers on every tower. The gates are barricaded. They're ready for a siege. Which we can't afford, Kyle said. A siege would starve the civilians as much as the soldiers, and it would give Corvin time to consolidate power, execute anyone loyal to the crown, turn the city into a fortress we'd have to tear down stone by stone. So what do we do? Alara asked. Kyle's eyes were hard. We don't fight our way in. We walk in. Harvick stared at him. Sire? They're holding power based on a lie, Kyle interrupted. That I died in battle. If I walk through those gates alive, in front of the entire city, their justification evaporates. The soldiers will hesitate. The people will question. And that hesitation is all we need. They'll kill you the second you're in arrow range, Harvick protested. Not if the people see me first, Kyle said. Not if Alara tells them the truth before Corvin can spin another lie. All eyes turned to Alara. She felt her throat tighten. You want me to address the city? I want you to do what you did for my army, Kyle said. Tell them what happened. Show them the map. Make them see that Corvin and his allies murdered innocents to keep a war going. Once the truth is out, the city will turn on them. And if it doesn't work, Harvick demanded. Kyle's smile was grim. Then we die trying to do the right thing. But at least we'll die with our eyes open. Harvick looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Kyle's expression stopped him. He nodded slowly. Then we do it your way, sire. But I'm bringing 100 men, hidden in the crowd, ready to move if things go wrong. Agreed. Kale turned to Alara, his voice softening. I'm asking a lot of you, I know that, but I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe you could do this. Alara's hands trembled, but she nodded. I'll do it. For Tam. For my father. For everyone who died because of their lies. Kyle took her hand and squeezed it. Thank you. They approached the gates as a noon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. Kyle rode at the front, dressed in simple traveling clothes rather than royal regalia. He wanted to look like a man, not a symbol, someone the people could relate to, could believe in. Alara rode beside him, the blood-stained map tucked inside her coat, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Behind them, Harvick and his 100 soldiers followed at a distance, weapons hidden beneath cloaks. As they approached, archers appeared on the walls, arrows knocked. A voice rang out, cold and commanding. Halt! The city is under martial law. Turn back or be fired upon. Kyle didn't slow. I am King Kyle Thorn. I've come to reclaim my throne. Open the gates! Laughter echoed from the walls, cruel, mocking. The king is dead, the voice shouted. Killed in battle. You're an imposter and you'll hang for it. Then send someone to verify, Kyle called back. Or are you afraid of what they'll see? Silence. Then, slowly, a smaller gate beside the main entrance creaked open. A man emerged, middle-aged, wearing the robes of a council member, flanked by armed guards. He approached cautiously, suspicion written across his face. When he was close enough to see Kyle clearly, he stopped dead. It is you, he whispered, his face going pale. But Lord Corvin said... Corvin lied, Kyle said flatly. About my death. About the war. About everything. His master Malrek is dead, burned in his own treachery. And now Corvin is perpetuating those lies to steal power that was never his. The councilman's eyes darted between Kyle and the walls. This is impossible. It's the truth, Alara said, her voice cutting through his confusion. And the people deserve to hear it. The councilman looked at her, seeing her for the first time. Who are you? Someone whose family died because of their lies, Alara said. And I'm not leaving until everyone knows what they did. The councilman's face worked, fear and calculation warring in his expression. Finally, he turned to the guards. Open the gates. The guards hesitated, looking up at the walls uncertainly. I said, open them, the councilman shouted, his voice cracking. The king lives! Open the gates! Slowly, reluctantly, the massive gates began to grind open. Kael and Ilara rode through, and the city swallowed them whole. The streets were packed with people, thousands of them pressed together in the cold, their faces drawn with fear and confusion, their eyes hollow from weeks of uncertainty. When they saw Kael riding through the gates, a ripple of shock ran through the crowd, spreading like wildfire. "The king, he's alive, but they told us." Kael rode slowly, deliberately, letting them see him, letting the reality sink in. Beside him, Ilara kept her spine straight, her chin high, even though every instinct screamed at her to hide, to run, to disappear into the crowd. They reached the central plaza, where a massive wooden platform had been erected. On it stood a dozen men in expensive robes, Malrek's allies, the provisional council that had seized power. At their center was Lord Coffin, tall and thin, with pale eyes and a face like chiseled ice. When he saw Kael, his expression didn't change, but his hand moved to the sword at his hip. "This is a trick," Coffin announced, his voice carrying across the plaza. "An impostor sent by our enemies to sow confusion. Guards, arrest this man!" But the city guards didn't move. They stood frozen, staring at Kael, uncertainty etched across their faces. Kael dismounted, moving carefully to avoid reopening his wound. He walked to the base of the platform, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "I am King Kael Thorn. 3 days ago I destroyed the enemy's stronghold at Druvik using intelligence that should have ended this war months ago. But traitors within my command, men like Lord Coffin, murdered the mapmaker who tried to deliver that intelligence. They burned villages. They killed innocents. They prolonged a war that bled this kingdom dry, all to preserve their own power." He pointed at Coffin. "This man spread lies about my death. He seized the palace. He threatened to execute anyone who opposed him. And he did it all while wearing the mask of legitimacy, claiming to act in the kingdom's best interest." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Corvin's face flushed with rage. "Lies!" he spat. "This man abandoned his army to chase after a peasant girl. He's weak, sentimental, unfit to rule. I acted to preserve order, to prevent chaos." "You acted to preserve yourself," Kael said coldly. "And now it's time for the truth." He gestured to Ilara. "Come up here." Alara's legs felt like water, but she forced herself to move. She climbed the platform steps, feeling thousands of eyes on her, and stood beside Kael. "This is Ilara Ven," Kael said. "Tell them what happened." Alara's throat was dry. Her hands shook as she pulled out the map, unfolding it so the crowd could see. For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Then she saw Tam's face in her mind, heard his laugh, remembered the promise she'd made. "My name is Ilara Ven," she said, her voice barely above a whisper at first. 4 days ago, soldiers came to my village. They wore the king's banner. They said we were harboring spies. We weren't. My father was a mapmaker who worked for the crown. My brother was 12 years old." Her voice grew stronger. "They burned our home. They killed my father. My brother tried to run and they cut him down in the street like he was nothing." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ilara felt tears on her cheeks but didn't wipe them away. "I buried him on a mountain where my mother rests because I promised him he wouldn't die alone in the ashes. And when I came back, I found this." She held up the map. "My father made this before he died. A complete schematic of the enemy stronghold at Druvik. Every tunnel, every weak point, everything needed to end the war. He was bringing it to the king when soldiers following orders from Lord Malrek murdered him." She turned to face Coffin directly. "Your master Malrek couldn't let the war end. He needed the chaos, the fear, the desperation, because without it, he was nothing. So he ordered attacks on innocent villages. He forged documents. He sent assassins after the king. And when his plan failed, when the king destroyed Druvik and ended the war anyway, you tried to finish what Malrek started." Her voice rose, fierce and raw. "You lied to these people. You used their fear. You threatened their lives. And you did it all while claiming to protect them. But the only thing you were protecting was your own power." The plaza erupted. Shouts of anger, of betrayal, of fury. The crowd surged forward, and Corvin's allies stumbled back, fear replacing their arrogance. "This is sedition!" Coffin screamed. "Guards! Arrest them both! I command you!" But the guards didn't move. Instead, the captain, a grizzled veteran with scars across his face, stepped forward and drew his sword. He pointed it at Corvin. "No," the captain said quietly. "You're under arrest for treason, murder, and conspiracy against the crown." Corvin's face twisted with rage. "You dare!" "I dare," the captain said, "because I swore an oath to the king, not to you." More guards surrounded the platform, their weapons trained on Corvin and his allies. The crowd roared its approval, pressing closer, demanding justice. Cale raised his hand, and gradually the noise subsided. "Lord Corvin," he said, his voice cold, "you have one chance. Confess your crimes here, in front of these people, and you'll live to stand trial. Refuse, and I'll let them decide your fate." Corvin's lips peeled back in a snarl. "You're weak, Kyle, just like your father. This kingdom doesn't need a king who stops for peasant girls and cries over burned villages. It needs strength. It needs—" One of the other councilmen broke. "It's true," he screamed, falling to his knees. "All of it. Malrek planned everything. The village attacks, the forged orders, the assassination attempts. He told us the king was dead. He said we had to act or the kingdom would fall into chaos. We believed him. We didn't know." "Coward," Corvin spat. But the damage was done. Another councilman confessed, then another. Within minutes, the entire conspiracy lay bare. Malrek's ambition, Corvin's ruthlessness, the web of lies that had nearly torn the kingdom apart. Corvin stood alone, surrounded by his former allies' confessions, his face white with impotent fury. "You think you've won?" he hissed at Kyle. "You think the kingdom will follow a sentimental fool who wastes time on dead peasants? You're nothing without strength, without fear." Kale's fist caught him across the jaw, a brutal strike that sent Corvin sprawling. The crowd cheered. Kyle stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. "I am not my father," he said quietly. "I won't rule through fear. I won't sacrifice innocence for political gain. And I won't let men like you corrupt what this kingdom is supposed to be." He turned to the guards. "Lock them all up. Every councilman who participated in this conspiracy. They'll stand trial, and they'll answer for every life they destroyed." The guards moved forward, hauling Corvin and the others away. The crowd roared, chanting Kyle's name, but he didn't acknowledge it. He turned to Alara, his expression softening. "You did it," he said. Alara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Kyle took her hand and raised it high. "This woman saved your kingdom," he called out. "Her courage, her refusal to accept lies, her determination to seek justice, that's what ended the war. That's what exposed the traitors. Remember her name, Alara Ven." The crowd took up the chant. "Alara Ven, Alara Ven." She stood there, stunned, tears streaming down her face as thousands of voices shouted her name. The girl who had been nobody. The girl whose family burned. The girl who dragged a coffin through the snow. They saw her now. The trials lasted 2 weeks. One by one, Corvin's allies were brought before a tribunal of judges, military officers, and elected civilian representatives. Kyle insisted on transparency. Every session was open to the public, every piece of evidence displayed for all to see. The first trial began on a gray morning, the tribunal chamber packed with citizens eager to see justice served. Alara sat in the gallery watching as the first conspirator, a fat merchant named Torek, who had profited from inflated war contracts, was led to the stand in chains. The evidence was damning, documents showing he'd paid bribes to Malrek, testimony from soldiers who'd been forced to use substandard equipment that he'd provided at premium prices, letters detailing his knowledge of the village burnings. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the gallery erupted in applause. But Alara felt no satisfaction, just a hollow ache where justice should have been. She found Kyle afterward in his study, surrounded by papers, his face drawn with exhaustion. "You didn't stay for the sentencing," he said without looking up. "I couldn't." Alara sat across from him. Watching him squirm, watching the crowd celebrate, it doesn't bring them back. My father, Tam, all the others, Torek's punishment doesn't undo what he did. Kale finally looked at her. "No, it doesn't, but it prevents him from doing it again. And it shows the kingdom that no one is above justice. Not merchants, not nobles, not even kings." "Is that enough?" "It has to be," Kyle said quietly, "because it's all we have." Most of the conspirators confessed under the weight of testimony and documentation. Those who didn't were convicted anyway. Kyle showed mercy where he could, exile rather than execution for those who had been coerced or misled. But for the architects of the conspiracy, for those like Coffin who had knowingly murdered innocents, there was no mercy. Coffin trial came last. He stood before the tribunal with his head high, refusing to show remorse even as witness after witness detailed his crimes. The burning of 17 villages, the execution of 43 people who had questioned his authority, the embezzlement of funds meant for war widows and orphans. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, Coffin smiled coldly. "I did what was necessary. History will vindicate me. You'll see. When this weak king's sentimentality plunges the kingdom back into chaos, you'll remember that I tried to save you from yourselves." The gallery erupted in angry shouts. Kale silenced them with a raised hand. "Lord Coffin," he said, his voice like iron, "you are convicted of high treason, murder, conspiracy, and crimes against the people of this kingdom. The sentence is death." Corvin's smile never faltered. "So be it. But know this, boy king, killing me won't change what you are, weak, sentimental, doomed." He was executed 3 days later, hanged in the central plaza. He died cursing Kyle, unrepentant to the end. Alara didn't attend the execution. She'd seen enough death. Instead, she spent the day in the palace archives, poring over maps and census records, planning her next project. If the kingdom was going to rebuild, it needed more than justice. It needed hope. It needed investment in the places that had been destroyed. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear Kyle enter until he spoke. "You're avoiding the executions." She looked up. "I've seen men die. I don't need to watch more." Kale sat beside her, studying the maps spread across the table. "What's all this?" "The destroyed villages," Alara said. 17 of them burned on Corvin's orders, plus another 30 that were damaged in the fighting. I'm trying to calculate what it would take to rebuild them. Supplies, labor, cost. Kyle picked up one of her lists, his eyebrows rising. "This is ambitious." "It's necessary," Alara said. "These people lost everything. If we want them to believe in the kingdom again, we can't just punish the guilty. We have to help the victims." "Agreed, but the treasury is nearly empty. 3 years of war drained our reserves." "Then we raise taxes on the nobility," Alara said bluntly. "They profited from the war while villages burned. Let them contribute to rebuilding what was destroyed." Kyle stared at her. "You're serious?" "Completely." He laughed. A real laugh, the first she'd heard in days. "You realize the nobles will hate this? They'll say you're punishing them for crimes they didn't commit." "Good," Alara said. "Let them complain to me. I'll explain exactly why their comfort matters less than children having roofs over their heads." Kale took her hand, his expression softening. "You're remarkable. You know that?" Alara flushed. "I'm just doing what needs to be done. That's what makes you remarkable." He leaned in and kissed her, soft and sweet, and for a moment the weight of rebuilding a kingdom faded. When they broke apart, Alara rested her forehead against his. "Do you think we can actually do this? Rebuild everything that was broken?" "I don't know," Kale said honestly, "but I know we have to try. And I know I can't do it without you." The weeks that followed were exhausting. Alara threw herself into the rebuilding efforts with a ferocity that surprised even her. She traveled to damaged villages, spoke with survivors, cataloged needs. She argued with nobles who resented the new taxes. She negotiated with merchants for fair prices on building materials. She worked 18-hour days until Kyle physically dragged her away from her desk and made her sleep. But slowly, progress emerged. The first village to be rebuilt was called Ashford, the place where Alara's family had died. Kale insisted on it, and Alara couldn't argue. Returning there was like walking through a grave, but she forced herself to do it. The ruins were exactly as she remembered. Blackened timbers, scorched earth, the skeletal remains of homes that had once housed families. She stood in the center of what had been the village square, memories threatening to overwhelm her, Tam laughing as he chased chickens, her father bent over his maps by candlelight, her mother singing as she cooked dinner. All gone. "We'll make it beautiful again," Kyle said quietly, standing beside her. "I promise." Alara nodded, not trusting her voice. They broke ground the next day. Workers came from the capital, carpenters, masons, laborers. Supplies arrived by wagon, and slowly, painfully, Ashford began to rise from the ashes. Alara worked alongside the builders, hauling timber, mixing mortar, refusing to stand aside while others did the physical labor. The workers respected her for it. They called her the Builder Queen, though she insisted she wasn't a queen at all. One evening, as the sun set over the half-rebuilt village, an old woman approached Alara. She was one of the survivors, a widow who had lost her husband and 2 sons in the burning. "I remember you," the woman said. "You're the Venn girl. Your father made the maps." Alara's throat tightened. "Yes. He was a good man, kind, always had time to help people find their way." The woman's eyes were wet. "I'm sorry for what happened to your family." "I'm sorry for yours," Alara said. They stood in silence for a moment. Then the woman said, "What you're doing here, rebuilding, giving us hope, your father would be proud." Alara's composure broke. She pulled the old woman into a hug, both of them crying, sharing grief that words couldn't touch. When she returned to the capital that night, exhausted and emotionally raw, Kael was waiting in their chambers. "How was it?" he asked. "Hard," Alara said, "but necessary." She told him about the woman, about the memories, about the strange mixture of pain and purpose she felt working in the ruins of her old life. Kael listened without interrupting, then pulled her close. "You're the strongest person I know." "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm barely holding together." "That's what strength looks like," Kael said. "It's not about never breaking. It's about breaking and still getting up the next morning." 3 months after the trials ended, the kingdom began to breathe again. Trade routes reopened, markets bustled, soldiers returned home to find work in rebuilding efforts rather than battlefields. The constant fear that had gripped the capital for 3 years slowly eased. But change came slowly to the nobility. Many resented Kael's reforms, the new taxes, the civilian oversight of military spending, the seats on the council given to commoners rather than lords. A delegation of nobles requested an audience with the king. Kael granted it, with Alara at his side. They filed into the throne room in their expensive silks and jewels, faces tight with poorly concealed anger. Their spokesman, a portly duke named Heron, stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he said, his tone barely respectful, "we come on behalf of the noble houses to express our concerns about recent policies." "Speak plainly, Heron," Kael said. "What concerns?" "The new taxes are crippling our estates. The inclusion of commoners on the council undermines centuries of tradition, and your—" he glanced at Alara with obvious disdain, "reliance on the counsel of a peasant girl calls into question your judgment." Silence. Alara felt every eye in the room turn to her. She saw the sneers, the barely hidden contempt, the belief that she didn't belong. Before Kael could respond, she stood. "You're right," she said calmly. "I am a peasant. My father was a mapmaker. My mother died of fever because we couldn't afford a physician. My brother was murdered in the street like he was nothing. I have no title, no bloodline, no inherited wealth." She walked down from the dais, stopping directly in front of Heron. "But I also have something you don't. I know what it's like to lose everything, to watch your family burn, to drag your brother's coffin through a blizzard because you promised him he wouldn't die alone in the ashes." Her voice hardened. "I know what this war cost. Not in gold or land or political capital, in lives, in families destroyed, in children who will never see their fathers again. And I will not apologize for caring about those people more than I care about your comfort." Heron's face flushed. "How dare you? How dare I?" Alara's eyes blazed. "How dare you? You sat in your comfortable estates while villages burned. You profited from contracts that sent soldiers to die with faulty equipment. You did nothing while Lord Malrek and his allies murdered innocents to keep a war going that lined your pockets." She stepped closer, and Heron actually took a step back. "The king's policies are designed to rebuild what the war destroyed. If that costs you some gold, some privilege, some pride, good. Consider it payment for the blood you profited from." Dead silence. Then Kael spoke, his voice quiet but carrying. "Lady Alara speaks for me in this matter. The policies stand. If you cannot accept that, you are free to retire to your estates and live off whatever wealth you have left. But you will not dictate policy in this kingdom. Not anymore. The nobles filed out, their faces thunderous. Heron shot Alara a look of pure hatred as he passed. When they were gone, Kael turned to her. You just made some powerful enemies. Good, Alara said. Maybe they'll finally understand what it's like to feel powerless. Kael laughed and pulled her into his arms. Marry me. Alara blinked, startled. What? Marry me, Kael repeated. I know it's sudden. I know we've been focused on rebuilding. But Alara, I can't imagine doing any of this without you. I don't want to. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a ring, simple silver, inlaid with a blue stone the color of winter sky. I'm not asking you to be a traditional queen. I'm asking you to be my partner, my equal. The person who keeps me honest when power threatens to corrupt me. The person who reminds me what we're fighting for. Alara stared at the ring, her heart pounding. She thought about everything that had brought them here. The grief, the loss, the impossible journey. She thought about Tam, about her father, about the life she'd lost. And she thought about the life she'd found. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Kael's face broke into a smile, pure, unguarded, filled with joy. He slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her, and for a moment, the weight of rebuilding a kingdom disappeared. They were married 3 months later in a ceremony that shattered every tradition. It wasn't held in the grand cathedral in the capital. Kael and Alara chose instead to marry in Ashford, in the newly rebuilt village church that stood where Alara's family home had once been. The gesture was deliberate, a symbol that the new kingdom would honor its humble roots as much as its grand history. Representatives came from across the kingdom. Nobles in their finery rubbed shoulders with farmers in their best clothes. Soldiers stood beside merchants. The old hierarchies, for one day at least, dissolved. Alara wore a simple dress of blue wool, the same color as her mother's favorite coat. She'd had it made by a seamstress in Ashford, using fabric woven by women who had lost everything and were learning to rebuild. Kael wore his military uniform, stripped of all decoration except the crown itself. General Harvick stood as his witness. The old woman from Ashford, the one who had known Alara's father, stood as hers. The ceremony was brief. The priest spoke of love forged in hardship, of strength found in vulnerability, of two people who had saved each other when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. When it came time for vows, Kael spoke first. Alara, when I met you, I was a king who had forgotten what he was supposed to be fighting for. You reminded me. You showed me that true strength isn't about conquest or control. It's about compassion, about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. I vow to spend every day trying to be worthy of you, to listen when I'd rather command, to show mercy when I'd rather show force, to build rather than destroy, and to love you, always, with everything I have. Alara's hands trembled as she spoke her own vows. Kael, when I met you, I was drowning in grief, convinced the world was nothing but cruelty and loss. You showed me I was wrong. You showed me that even in darkness there can be light, that even broken things can be made whole. I vow to stand beside you, not behind you, not beneath you, but beside you, to challenge you when you need it, to support you when you doubt, to remind you that a king's strength is measured not by the fear he inspires, but by the hope he gives, and to love you, always, exactly as you are. The priest pronounced them married, and the church erupted in celebration. That night, under stars that seemed brighter than they'd ever been, Kael and Alara stood together on the steps of the rebuilt church. Do you think they're watching? Alara asked softly, looking up at the sky. Tam and my father and my mother? Kael pulled her closer. I think they're celebrating too, because you did exactly what you promised. You gave Tam a proper burial, you brought the truth to light, and you helped build a kingdom where what happened to your family can never happen again. We built it, Alara corrected. Together. Together, Kael agreed. Years passed. The kingdom prospered under their joint rule, though Alara still refused traditional titles, insisting she was simply Alara, not Queen Alara or Lady Alara or any other formality. The frontier schools she'd championed opened one by one. giving children opportunities their parents had never dreamed of. Roads improved, connecting isolated villages to trade routes. A new council structure gave voice to representatives from every region, not just the nobility. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, complaints, nobles who chafed under the new order. But slowly, steadily, the kingdom healed. Kyle ruled with wisdom born of hard lessons, always consulting, always listening, never forgetting the cost of arrogance. And Alara became something the kingdom had never seen before. Not a queen in the traditional sense, but a voice for the voiceless. She traveled constantly, visiting villages, listening to concerns, bringing those concerns back to the capital, and refusing to let them be ignored. People called her the voice of the frontier, the builder, the woman who stopped a war. But to Alara, she was simply someone trying to honor a promise made to a 12-year-old boy in a burning village. 5 years after their wedding, on a cold winter morning, Alara returned to the mountain one final time. She was older now, no longer the desperate girl who had dragged a coffin through the snow. Lines creased the corners of her eyes. Her hands were rough from work, but she still climbed with the same determination that had carried her through that first impossible journey. Kael came with her, as he always did. Together they reached the burial ground, where Tam's grave stood unmarked except for the cairn Alara had built, and the beautiful stone cross Kael had commissioned years ago. Alara knelt in the snow and placed fresh flowers on the grave, winter roses, Tam's favorite. "I did it," she said softly. "I kept my promise. I buried you here, on this mountain. And I made sure your death meant something. The kingdom is different now. Children like you get to go to school, get to learn, get to dream. No one burns villages anymore. No one kills innocents and calls it duty." Her voice caught. "I wish you could see it. I wish you could see what we built. But I hope, wherever you are, you're proud of me." The wind howled across the peaks, carrying snow and memory. Kael placed his hand on her shoulder. "He is proud. I know he is." Alara stood and took one last look at the grave. "I won't come back next year," she said quietly. Kael looked at her, surprised. "Why not?" "Because I've spent 5 years visiting a grave, 5 years carrying grief like a second skin. And I think it's time to let it go. Not to forget, never to forget, but to stop letting it define me." She touched the stone cross gently. "Tam wouldn't want me to spend my life mourning. He'd want me to live, to be happy, to keep building the world we dreamed about on those cold nights when we thought the war would never end." Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. "So this is goodbye. Not forever. Just goodbye to the grief. Goodbye to the girl who dragged a coffin through the snow. I'll carry you in my heart, Tam, always. But I won't carry the pain anymore." She turned to Kael, and he pulled her into his arms. Together, they walked down the mountain for the last time. Behind them, the grave stood silent, a testament to a boy who died too young, to a sister who refused to let his death be meaningless, and to a kingdom that had been reborn through their shared sacrifice. 10 years later, Alara stood in the newly expanded council chambers, addressing representatives from across the kingdom. Her hair had more gray now, and there were deeper lines around her eyes. But her voice was as strong as ever, her presence as commanding. She was presenting a proposal to establish a memorial, not just for the war dead, but for all the civilians who had suffered. A place where names would be carved in stone, where families could come to remember, where the kingdom would pledge never to forget the cost of corruption and ambition. The council voted unanimously in favor. Afterward, as she walked through the palace gardens with Kael, she felt a peace she'd never thought possible. "We did it," she said. "We actually rebuilt the kingdom." Kael took her hand. "You rebuilt it. I just tried to keep up." Alara laughed. "We did it together, like everything else." They stopped beside a fountain, watching the water catch the afternoon light. "Do you ever regret it?" Kael asked. "Staying here? Giving up the quiet life you could have had?" Alara considered. "Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if I'd just stepped aside that day. Let your army pass. Let the war play out without me. I'd probably be dead in a ditch somewhere, or maybe I'd have disappeared into some remote village, lived a quiet life, died quietly, been forgotten." She squeezed his hand. "But then I think about the schools we built, the villages we rebuilt, The children who have futures now because we refuse to let corruption win. And I know I made the right choice. Even on the hard days? Especially on the hard days. Kale pulled her close and kissed her forehead. I love you. I love you too. They stood together in the garden, two people who had found each other in the darkest moment of their lives and had built something beautiful from the ashes. 20 years after the war ended, historians began writing accounts of what they called the Great Reconstruction. They documented the reforms, the policies, the systematic changes that had transformed the kingdom from a war-torn autocracy into a more equitable society. But in the villages, in the frontier towns, in the places where ordinary people lived their lives, they told a different story. They told of a girl named Elaraven, who stood in the road and stopped a king's army, who dragged her brother's coffin through a blizzard because she'd made a promise, who faced down tyrants and traitors with nothing but truth and courage. They told of how she changed a kingdom not through force or birthright, but through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that the world had to be cruel. And they told their children, be strong, be brave, stand your ground when it matters, because one person, in the right place at the right time, can change everything. Alara lived to be 73 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep, Kael's hand in hers, surrounded by the children and grandchildren they'd raised, a family built not just on blood, but on love and shared purpose. Her funeral was the largest the kingdom had ever seen. Thousands came to pay their respects, from nobles to farmers, from soldiers to merchants, from every corner of the realm. But the most moving tribute came from an unexpected source. A young girl, no more than 12, stepped forward at the memorial service. She was from Ashford, the village that had been rebuilt first. My name is Talia, she said, her voice shaking but clear. I never met Elaraven. She died before I was born. But I know her story. Everyone knows her story. She held up a small wooden box. My grandmother knew her family, and she told me that Alara once said the only thing stronger than grief is the choice to keep going despite it. Talia opened the box, revealing a handful of seeds. These are from flowers that grow on the mountain where Alara buried her brother. My grandmother saved them, and now I'm going to plant them here, in the memorial garden, so that something beautiful grows from something broken. She knelt and planted the seeds with trembling hands. As the years passed, those flowers bloomed every spring, brilliant blue petals the color of winter sky, spreading across the memorial garden like hope made visible. And when people came to remember the dead, to honor the sacrifices made, they would see those flowers and remember. Remember the girl who stopped a war. Remember that even in the darkest times, one person's courage can change the world. Remember that the smallest voice, when it refuses to be silenced, can echo across generations. Elaraven had kept her promise to her brother, and in doing so, she had given an entire kingdom a promise of its own, a promise that it would never again forget the cost of its choices, never again sacrifice the innocent for the ambitions of the powerful, never again silence the voices that needed most to be heard. It was a promise the kingdom kept. And it all began with a girl, a coffin, and a frozen road where a king learned what it truly meant to serve.